Hello and welcome to Stacy's Infinity Podcast Season 2. I'm your host, Dr. Stacy Cisneros, and this is a podcast where we make the energetic practical. I'm so excited to introduce my guest today is Dr. Nissa Keyashian. Dr. Keyashian is a psychiatrist, a coach, an author, and a holistic wellness leader who integrates her expertise in mental health with the transformative practice of yoga, breathwork, and meditation. With a deep commitment to mind-body healing, she guides individuals towards greater clarity, resilience, and purpose, whether in a clinical setting, in coaching settings, or in immersive retreats. Her approach blends science and soul, empowering others to reconnect with their inner wisdom and create meaningful, lasting change. Welcome, Dr. Nissa.
Thank you. It's so good to be here with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. I wanted to explore what really shifted your focus or actually expanded your focus from uh, practicing psychiatry and now doing these retreats and coaching. Could you share a little bit about your story?
Yeah, sure. I would love to. So I wrote a little bit about this in my book, Practicing Stillness. But I went to medical school to become a psychiatrist, but I got a little bit distracted along the way. I kind of fell in love with all of medicine. And then my dad's family is from Iran, and there might be even more stigma around mental health in Persian culture compared to American culture. And I had some pressure to go into internal medicine, and I started internal medicine residency at UC Davis in Sacramento. I basically did not enjoy it and ended up dealing with anxiety and depression, ended up leaving the program, and I was pretty lost. And during this time, my ex was very into meditation. And so there was like a lot of books in our house about meditation. And one of the books that he had was this book called Calming Your Anxious Mind. It's by a psychiatrist and it's all about mindfulness and meditation. And so I started reading this book, and I remember the author talks about the seven principles of mindfulness: acceptance, patience, trust, letting go, non judging, non striving, and beginner's mind. And it really occurred to me that I had been living my life in direct opposition to these principles. And I had this deep inner wisdom that this approach was going to help me tremendously. And so I started meditating and just kind of gobbling up all different kinds of authors. I really fell in love with Eckhart Tolle and Power of Now and Jack Kornfield and Sharon Salzberg. And I just started reading so much of this. And I had started yoga before, and so I started going back to yoga. I ultimately found my way back to psychiatry. I was seeing a therapist at that time, and she was like, "What did you want to do before you went to medical school?" And I was like, "Oh." And my dad lived in the area, and after my session, I went over to my dad's house, and I was like, "Dad, I'm gonna go into psychiatry." He's like, "Why? You want to work with crazy people?" And I don't like that phrase, but I was like, yeah, I do. And so I ended up going back to psychiatry, and I went to a very psychotherapy heavy program that I had known a lot about before. I ended up decided going into internal medicine, and I loved it. And when I was in residency, I was at a VA in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, and there was a psychologist there who was leading an MBSR group, that's mindfulness-based stress reduction. It's basically a clinical mindfulness program that John Kabat-Zinn developed in the 70s that has evidence in a number of medical issues. And I would just send a ton of patients to this psychologist, and he reached out. He's like, "Thank you so much for all the referrals." And he asked me if I wanted to come do the group with him. And so I did the group with him and I ended up doing a mindfulness clinician training program through Inside LA, which he was involved with. And I have been integrating mindfulness and yoga into my clinical care since then.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Um, I'm wondering what kind of like personal transformation you encountered, because you were saying that you were initially living your life opposite of all of those principles. And I'm curious to know what that was for you once you started re-implementing these techniques and what shifts you saw within yourself.
Yeah, so I am a very driven person and I tend a lot towards striving and that still is very much kind of like my default. And then also other challenges I've had is that I can be pretty impatient and I can be not really accepting. And so, and those things still come up quite a bit for me. I think it's an ongoing practice, but I think my practice of meditation, yoga, and other modalities has really helped me slow down. I think for so much of my life, I tied up my worth with how much I accomplished, like a lot of people do. And I am working to unravel the two, and just focus more on being a human being, not a human doing, that cheesy saying, but I feel like that resonates so much with me.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the work we do as coaches, we try to unpack that for our clients. And we're coming into this newer awareness where it's not about necessarily doing, like you said, it's about being and tapping back into that self that already has all those potentials and maybe shifting that default as we practice this a little bit more to sitting into I am this, and now let me express who I am and who I can be instead of the reverse, like I need to show people, I need to prove people that this is who I am, I need to exchange value, I need to blah, 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 right? And that whole shift is really transformational, really powerful. And I like what you said about having this awareness that this is the default of most of us. It's the default, I think, of most of our Western culture here, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So yeah, I think the work we do as physicians and as coaches, it's really important work because it's going to shift much of the way our clients see themselves, and we're also taking the lead in doing this work on ourselves too. So it's really
Right.
important work.
Absolutely. I love that.
Yeah. I like how you mentioned you host retreats. And tell me a little bit about that and what kind of experiences these retreats offer.
Yeah, so I went through yoga teacher training in 2020, and that was 200-hour, and I'm actually right now wrapping up a 300-hour yoga teacher training, which has been awesome. I used to love going to yoga retreats, and then in 2023, I started going to coaching retreats, and I loved those too. And I had this wild dream like, oh, what if I could combine yoga and coaching retreats? And years ago at a yoga retreat, I did high ventilation breath work. I'm not sure. Are you familiar with high ventilation breath work?
Yeah.
So, I don't know if you've heard of holotropic breath work before, but that was developed by a psychiatrist, Dr. Stan Groff. He's actually still alive. He was researching LSD back before it was illegal, the therapeutic applications of LSD. And when the funding dried up around that research because LSD became illegal, he noticed that his participants were breathing in this high ventilation manner in order to extend the expanded states of awareness that they had experienced with the LSD. And so when the funding dried up because LSD became illegal, Dr. Stan Groff began to study high ventilation breath work, and he developed holotropic breath work, and for decades researched and trained people and led holotropic breath work. And then I had done high ventilation breath work at a yoga retreat years ago, and it was a very powerful experience for me. And I was like, wow, this is super awesome. And then a couple years ago at a coaching retreat, I did it again. And I was like, oh my God, yes, this is amazing. And so when I did my first retreat, I went through this training called neurodynamic breath work, which is based on all the same principles of holotropic breath work. But by definition, holotropic breath work has to be done in person, and it's day-long workshops. And so some of my teachers who are holotropic breathwork instructors wanted to make this more accessible for more people. And so they lead this both in person and online. Holotropic breathwork is usually very long days, but they lead 60 and 90 minutes breathwork sessions. So I went through that training program, and I'm actually in another one of their training programs right now, just learning all about Stan Groff, the one who developed holotropic breathwork. He wrote a lot about the cartography of the psyche. So basically, there's a lot of similarities with Jung, just like diving into the unconscious. Dr. Groff really feels that birth trauma has a big effect on all of us. And so he wrote a lot about that. And so in the course that I'm taking right now, we're learning all of his cartography of the psyche, which is very interesting. I wasn't exposed to any of this during my psychiatry training, but it makes sense to me. It's interesting because psychoanalysts talk a lot about like right after the newborn is born and how breastfeeding and other aspects of our newborn life dramatically affect us. And a lot of times there's a lot of trauma around that. So if it's a couple hours later, that can affect our psyches. It makes sense. Maybe this can also affect our psyches too. So it's been really fascinating.
That is really interesting. And this is the first I'm hearing about this type of work. Since I'm not trained in breath work or in any type of therapy like this. Could you, for the listeners, describe what the breath work entails when we talk about therapy? The first thing I thought of was in my limited medical experience, I thought, okay, maybe breath work entails hyperventilating. I don't know.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about what this is and what do you think is the mechanism behind these states of awareness?
Yeah. So basically, it's high ventilation breath work. So you're moving a lot of air. So the importance is on deep breaths, but it's both deep and fast. So the depth is more important than the speed of it. So and you're breathing out your mouth. So you're moving a lot of air. And there's some research, there needs to be more. And there are some theories about how moving this amount of air, I believe it's related. A lot of the theories are based on just like the level of carbon dioxide in the brain, possibly. I don't know how familiar you are with neuroanatomy, but we spend a lot of our time in the default mode network, which basically tends to become more active in people who deal with depression and anxiety. It's a lot of self-ruminative thinking. And so I think a lot of the theories are that this high ventilation breath work affects CO2 levels and maybe takes the DMN like offline and maybe other networks come on. But a lot of this research is pretty rudimentary. There are people researching this, and I would love to learn more. It's very interesting because I have been going to Harvard's psychedelics conference and all of the work that they're doing around psychedelics and psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And it's really interesting because a number of these research trials being done in psychedelics actually uses Dr. Groff's framework because he studied breathwork for so long. So a lot of times they use a lot of his work to develop these clinical trials. And so it's kind of cool hearing about these two worlds. And I'm very interested in psychedelics. I have some colleagues who do ketamine assisted psychotherapy. I don't do that in my private practice, but it is very interesting to me. I'm very interested in the expanded states of awareness. And so just getting back to doing high ventilation breath work, and you're doing it to a very loud music set. The music is a very specific formula. So in our training, we learn to make these music sets, and basically it takes you on a journey. It starts with a lot of high rhythm drumming music to help you get your breath going, and then it moves through a lot of movie soundtrack music. There's no English language in it because we don't want to get you thinking. The whole point of the breath work is to drop in and out of your left brain thinking mind. And so there's no recognizable languages. There is some Sanskrit in some of the songs, but there's no recognizable language. So the combination of the breath work and the music takes you on this journey. And people have all kinds of different experiences. I've had transpersonal experiences, feeling like I was in past lives. I've had a couple of times where I feel like I've communicated with one of my dogs who passed away. And then one time when I was doing breath work, a beloved uncle I had just passed away. And I felt like I had what they call completions, where you speak or communicate with beings who've passed away. But people have all kinds of different experiences. You can have like body sensory experiences, you can relive experiences from your past. It's really awesome.
That sounds amazing. Yeah, and then going back to, I think you mentioned the default, what's it called?
Default mode network, the DMN, yeah.
Yeah. I did hear about that in the context of binaural beats and how some people try to simulate that through binaural beats so that you go into a deeper form of meditation. You have a deeper, supposedly, experience of completion and about tying up energetic loose ends in that
Yeah.
state.
Yeah.
Like you
That's
said, there's
awesome.
not a lot of research to back that yet, but it's a really interesting concept, and I'm liking that now there's a little bit more interest in it, and there can be a lot of potential new therapies, right?
Yeah.
Going forward.
Absolutely. Another one of my favorite things about breath work is, like I said, the whole point is to drop out of your left brain thinking mind. And I spend a lot of time in my left brain thinking mind. One of the reasons that I fell so much in love with breath work is the first time I did it, it felt like it was a meditation hack. So I've done a number of silent meditation retreats and they have been amazing. And the first time I did breath work, and this doesn't happen every time I do breath work, and people can have all different kinds of experiences, but the first time I did breath work, it felt like I was able to drop in and out of my left brain thinking mind in like 20 minutes, which took me maybe 3 days on a silent meditation retreat. And so I think that was one of the reasons that I loved it. It felt like this fast way to access these other states of consciousness. And I sometimes have the past life experiences and other transpersonal experiences, but what I often do have is this experience where I drop out of my left brain thinking mind and I'm more connected to curiosity and abundance and love. I think I spend a lot of time in a fear-based conditioning. I think a lot of this comes maybe from childhood trauma. I love reading about attachment, like insecure attachment, and how that affects us and how we get stuck in certain brain states. And so I think a lot of my default state is more fear-based and, like, what if this happens? And I remember when I was planning my first retreat, I was doing breath work, and a lot of times I was just worried about all these things with the retreat. And when I would do breath work, it let me step out of that fear and more into creativity, like, oh, I could try this or I could do this. So that was really awesome as well.
That's really cool. Yeah, just a lot of our minds, like you said, it's based on early childhood programs or even emotional needs that weren't met way back
Yeah.
when. And I would think that many conditions like anxiety or even things like limerence, right? or attachment styles. I don't know how, psychiatrists see limerence, but it seems like a maladaptive way of
Yeah.
getting one's needs met, and then the neural programming starts going off when
Yeah.
initially it's supposed to be protective, right, as a child, but then it becomes a little bit more dysfunctional as we go on, and other conditions too. I'm curious to know if you have any insight about that overlap between when you learn about attachment styles and other medical conditions that might have this issue happening.
Yeah, I'm not sure how familiar you are with attachment theory. John Bowlby developed it, and he was trained in psychoanalysis. And in some of his work, he worked around children who had gone through a lot of abuse. And before John Bowlby came around, psychoanalysis was mostly just around the inner workings of children and did not pay attention at all to children's environments and children's relationships. And John Bowlby really pioneered evidence-based, deep psychological work. He noticed how much our early childhood relationships affect us, like for our entire lives. And then his colleagues and successors, Mary Ainsworth and Mary Main, came up. So Mary Ainsworth developed this strange situation where they would study children's attachment and first delineated the different types of secure and insecure attachment. And then Mary Main developed the adult attachment interview, where you can basically interview somebody and determine what their attachment is. And then that has a very high predictive ability of telling you like what the attachment of their children will likely be. And a lot of this is just like passed down from generation to generation.
Wow, I didn't know that last part. Yeah, but yeah, you're right, because children learn from modeling growing up. And I also think that maybe it's the brainwave that we're predominantly in when we're infants and when we're children.
Yes.
You're
Yeah.
in a very receptive,
Yeah.
you know, state. And
You're basically mirroring your primary attachment's mental state. And if your primary attachment spent a lot of time, as a lot of people in this country do, in this like high sympathetic nervous system tone, or maybe they were depressed and maybe they just everything was mute, so absolutely, absolutely.
wow, yeah, so how do we find our way out of this? I know that's a big question.
And I think a lot of it is the work that we do, psychotherapy, coaching, and then the high ventilation breath work. Some people do psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And then I know you do some awesome work. I know I've asked you about this before, but will you remind me the work that you do?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I am a wound care physician, and I also do online coaching for mostly professionals who are stuck or are looking to do something that they've never done before. And so my two modalities I use are human design to give me insight as to the personality and the base energy that they're being and how they're being received in the world. And then I also use an energy modality called infinity healing. And it's mostly a tool to help shift subconscious belief systems that have really kept somebody stuck. And so with the infinity healing, it's a mix of, I would say, meditation, neurolinguistic programming,
Okay,
hypnosis, and other modalities.
very cool.
And yeah, and I tend to gravitate towards these modalities that are a bunch of things synthesized together, like the human design is Western astrology, I Ching, chakra, and Kabbalah all integrated.
Oh,
And
very
then so I
cool.
have that, and then I have the infinity healing. And so I
Yeah.
have like the best of all these different worlds just combining to help facilitate the client to their greater selves. So a lot of the belief work that I do with infinity healing has to do first with getting the emotions recognized. A lot of it has to do with even just filling out my intake form. A lot of people have said, in filling out your form, I feel like something is already releasing, something's already healing, because it first starts with observation of what's going on, it starts the unpacking process, right? And
Yeah.
so the first layer is addressing the emotions and accepting that they have emotions. And by the way, I'm not trained as a psychiatrist or therapist. These are just modalities that have been used in various circles. And I happened to learn it when I was actually very stuck in my life. And so even listening to Infinity Healing audio on playback was enough to really reboot my energy. I felt electricity going through me. So I also had my own experience with my modality. And then something in me was like, I should probably look into this because it was so profound and
Yeah.
transformative, which
Yeah,
is
that's
kind of
awesome.
like what you were experiencing when you were learning about the modalities that you're really interested in, and something in you is like, yes, let's be drawn here, let's heal ourselves and let's share it with
Yeah.
everybody, right?
Yeah, it's that inner wisdom. In breathwork, they talk about this higher self. I'm not sure if you are familiar with internal family systems, but Dr. Dick Schwartz talks about the self with a capital S, and he draws that from a lot of like spiritual traditions. And in breathwork, they refer to that as the higher self or your inner guiding intelligence. And so, like you were just saying, our higher selves kind of brought us to these modalities that knew would be very healing for us and possibly other people.
I love this conversation about, the higher self and um, our spirits, whatever you like to call it. Other people call it super consciousness. There's so many different words for it. In my particular journey, I've come to understand that these are basically the same things, although the names have different nuances to this thing that we're describing that's leading us, our greater selves. And that's my curiosity about, at least for my own journey, how to strengthen that connection, because I somehow believe that if that connection is strengthened, I begin to express more and more of who I really am going forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Gabor Mate's work, but he talks about going back to attachment. And John Bowlby and his successors wrote and write a lot about this, that as children, we have a deep inner drive to connect with our primary attachment figures because pretty much all mammals need to be taken care of to some extent. And we're the most dependent when we're babies. And so we have this inner drive to connect. And when we're young, we know that our survival, even though this is primarily unconscious, we know that our survival depends on that connection. And so we sacrifice our authenticity for connection. And I think a lot of therapy and coaching and helping people heal is letting go of that, because we bring that into our adult life, right? Where we sacrifice our connection to ourselves for connection to other people. And although this served us when we were young, a lot of times it doesn't continue to serve us. And so, how can we reconnect back to our own authenticity?
Yeah, that was so well said, because I think you really summarized what you, I, and many other practitioners are doing, especially even with coaching, that we're looking at our clients and ourselves as basically at the core, we're whole.
Yeah,
And part of that work is removing or helping that
yeah,
person step out of that pattern or that belief
yeah,
system so that they can express their wholeness, because there's something there. Like we
yeah,
were discussing, there's a program there, or there's something that we've been holding on to that once helped us, but now
yeah.
is dysfunctional. So
And I think also what lends support to this idea as well for me is just when people are at the end of their lives, their biggest concerns, a lot of times it was like, I wasn't true to myself. And I think reflecting on mortality is one of the most powerful ways that we can connect to our higher selves and our authentic selves. Because sometimes we get lost in these left brain thinking minds just assuming that we're all going to live to 100, getting stuck on that, like, oh, once I accomplish this, then I'll be fine, and just wanting more, and getting stuck in the ego mind, like ego as spiritual teachers talk about it. And I think reflecting on mortality and just being with people who are at the end of their lives can really help us get very clear about what is important.
That's a really good point. I work with many elderly people in my clinic, and I absolutely love spending time with them. I have the benefit of being able to chat a little bit while I'm doing my work with them in clinic. And some of what they have to share is just priceless. It's about with the wisdom they share about living and how it is to deal with difficulties and things like that, even if they're not practitioners or anything like that. It's beautiful because they're reflecting back to you who we really are and how to be in the world when they've lived a life that's really well lived and true to themselves. I like that you mentioned um, our end of the life as a perspective that we just step out and look and see what really matters. So, Dr. Nissa, thank you so much. We explored so many amazing, deep topics, and I'd like if you could share any words of wisdom. I mean, we've basically shared a lot of wisdom today, but if you could leave the listeners with a thought, what would you like to convey today?
I think just to open your mind. I think as physicians or other professionals, I love science and science is so important, but just because we don't have evidence for something doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, right? And I think a lot of people just get really stuck to what we know. And I think if you can step out and maybe be open and try some of these other areas, I think it can just really help with healing and finding that authentic connection that we're talking about.
Wonderful. Thank you. And for the listeners, where can they find you and your work or maybe join you on your next retreat?
Yeah, so my website is just my name, nissakeyashian.com, and there's a link on there to my psychiatric private practice if you happen to be in California. But I do work in my coaching practice with people outside of California. I mentioned my book, Practicing Stillness. It's available on Amazon. Basically, it's an introduction to meditation and yoga with psychotherapeutic principles weaved throughout. And if you want to see my favorite parts of that book and join my email list, there's a link on my website for that.
Okay. And we'll have a link to Dr. Nissa's information in the description. I'd like to really thank you for joining me today. And for the listeners, thank you so much for joining me again on Stacy's Infinity Podcast. Until next time, honor yourself and trust your inner wisdom.
The information in this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only and is not intended to be used as a substitute for legal, financial, or professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Listening to this podcast does not create a physician-patient relationship with Stacy Cisneros, Anastasia Cisneros-Frausto, MD, or any guest on the podcast. Always seek the advice of your personal physician or qualified healthcare professional with any questions regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you heard on this podcast.